So next up, we have Jon Bentley. Jon is OpenAthens Commercial Director. He came to OpenAthens a little over 3 years ago, I think, and prior to that had a life in publishing, both traditional and digital, I believe. So it says here. And he now is one of the senior leadership team of OpenAthens, helping to drive the future of the product. He'll be co-presenting, I believe, with David Orrell, who is the architect, but Jon will introduce David when the time comes. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mike, for that introduction. Yes, I'm Jon Bentley, the Commercial Director. I'm part of a double act for the next half hour, in which David will definitely be the straight man. And yeah, we're really, really excited to be here. There's lots of ideas running through my head after listening to William speak. A lot of what we will talk about in the next half an hour relate to authenticity, about who you are, who am I in the technical context, and most importantly about trust. So there's two things we're going to be talking about. I will give a little sort of 5-minute introduction about trust, how I perceive that to be so important in the relationships that we have between libraries, end users and the publishers. And then David will talk about the technology. And I just say a word, I'll introduce David now. I mean, David's insight, his intelligence, his technical expertise underpin the foundations of everything that we do that is good about OpenAthens. So it's a great opportunity to hear and listen to David, him talking about where he thinks the future of authentication will go. So I'm going to start by talking about trust. We heard a lot about publishers, but in a world where trust in our institutions seems to be dwindling faster every day, I think the role of the libraries as curators of information is incredibly important. So I have here a quote I found on Twitter last week. This is a chap called Andy Wright, who contributed to a report for the Society of Chief Librarians. And I do think libraries are uniquely trusted. And I do think that concept of curated information is incredibly important. And it's something that we shouldn't lose. And the interesting thing is it talks about a space there. And yes, we're all familiar with certainly standing in the British Library, we're familiar with the concept of the library as a space. But libraries are changing, they are evolving. And what is a digital library? And how do we ensure that we establish and maintain that trust and that quality? And I think that's a really important part about the technology and the digital world that we live in. So I want to talk about who am I? So at the heart of all of this is the question of our identity. So I downloaded this before this stuff kicked off about Cambridge Analytica, because this is my Facebook profile. There was something in The Guardian that I read that said you should go and download your Facebook data. So I did. And this is what I discovered. And if you look at the list of attributes, you've got profiles. So there's a specific date. I know to the minute, the date I joined Facebook, which felt kind of creepy. The messages, I've read my messages, all the messages that I've sent people over sort of the 10 years. It's cringeworthy. It's just embarrassing. So it's just, my goodness, the fact that that is available and out there is something that I feel, strangely diminished by. And then I look at the ads, and this is the information. This is who Facebook thinks I am. If I look at these are the ads I'm interested in. Biscuits. It's true, I do like biscuits. So that's kind of right. And there's comedy movies. I wouldn't say that describes who I am at all. But there's a lot of there in there that is accurate, but I'm not a heavy user of Facebook. So this was quite easy. I just went on, clicked a button, download your data, and this is who I am. But there's no validation in that. No one has come to me and said, prove it, stamped it. Then maybe that is another Jon Bentley. Admittedly, I have the password. But yeah, this is an interesting concept. So Facebook has this image of who am I, and there's been no validity or authenticity around that. So who am I? There's an I missing there. And the platforms that we all engage with, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, whatever they are collecting all this information. They're hoovering it all up, and then they're using it to try and influence. The optimist will say they're doing it in a positive way, in a way which will enable and facilitate and improve the lives we lead. But there are real disturbing undercurrents, particularly when you read about the stuff that's happening with Cambridge Analytica. And again, so who am I? Is that to be trusted? So I was at a technical conference on identity and access management just the other week. And what I want you to remember from this image is not that it's a bottle of rum, but that it's 80% proof. And what they were saying, particularly in this networked world of social identities, you've only got sort of a 1 in 5 chance that that person is who they say they are. So many of the identities that are created are fake. There's no proof there, so they gave a number of estimates, say 10%. And then of the remainder, there's 10% that are used fraudulently, which are either sort of shared by friends or stolen. So you have a 1 in 5 chance of actually believing who that person is, who they say they are online, which is why the authenticity around all of this becomes so important. And this is a quote from a chap called Stephen Covey. He's a sort of business leader. But in terms of that importance of trust in the relationship we have, particularly commercial relationships, and that's one of the things I wanted to touch on. So much of what we do as a technology vendor, as the libraries, the end user, the publisher, it has to be about trust, and it is built on commercial relationships, commercial contracts. So that those people who are using your library, who are accessing the content within terms of the license, have to be compliant. And if you don't, things will fail. And that's, again, where I believe our technology helps to support that. So when I talk about trust in the federated single sign-on environment or the federated access management sign-on, I'm talking about 3 different people. Who can you trust? I think that makes it slightly more complicated. So the trust and the federation, as we see it, if you were to think about a federated single sign-on environment as establishing a network of trust between these 3 parties, I sort of used to call about the triumvirate of trust or tri-party trust. You've got the end user, the publisher, and the library. And what's happening in a federated environment is there's metadata getting passed in the background, which has been stamped for authenticity, particularly by that institution, and hopefully by the library as well. And that trust drives so many things. There's quality through curation. The user experience needs to be good. We want to use that technology and that trust to ensure we have security and privacy. I loved William's slide between that sort of battle between safety or security and freedom. I think that's a real, it's a real battleground where we're confronting in the digital space, because you need that transparency. But how do you balance that transparency to get compliance? And all of that is built around the commerce and the contracts that I talked about. And we recently ran some UX research, a user experience research with one of our customers in the higher education market in the UK. And we love that access is based on payment. And for that payment to have value, you definitely need trust. Because a federated world isn't magic. It's really, really, quite complex infrastructure, policies all around that. So now I am going to pass over to the main event, which is David, to talk about how our technology supports and enhances and facilitates that trust. So here's David.
Right, well, thanks, John. Well, I think everyone today is going to use the recent Facebook scandal, if you call it that, around the media as like an intro to their talk. I mean, I think not only does it show just what an important issue identity is to the technology industry, it shows that it's the information that's held about us online is important to society, like hugely. It's sort of one of the most important issues of our times. And the recent media attention around Facebook has obviously brought this to the forefront. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the authentication space more generally. I'm going to maybe step aside a little bit from the publisher library space and talk about what online identity means, how we authenticate, how we interact as users. And we're going to hear a lot today about federated identity, and it's one of the key technologies in the identity space at the moment. So for people who aren't familiar, what federated identity essentially is, it's allowing identity information about us as individuals or members of an organization to be shared between entities, and crucially shared between entities that live in different domains. So it might be my university and a publisher, might be me and a shop that I'm purchasing from. But these are sort of different domains, and federated identity gives tools to control what information is being shared in those sorts of scenarios. A couple of years ago, Gartner were already saying that federated identity is now the predominant technology that drives single sign-on. And some of the real factors that are driving the growth and adoption of federated identity are the cloud. Our organizations are constantly constantly turning to cloud services, software as a service, Office 365, our HR systems are going online. And to be able to reuse and share identity information in these scenarios is really one of the key driving factors. The way that we actually interact with networks, we have multiple devices. We want to access the same information with multiple devices on the move at our desks. So again, we need to identify ourselves to those applications in all of those different scenarios. We hear quite a lot in the technology space about the Internet of Things. All of these increasing number of internet-connected devices, whether they're in our homes, whether they're in our cities, these all have the same sort of requirements that we as individuals interacting with applications have. So we're already getting terms like the identity of things being coined. So these devices need to share information, usually, or push information into the cloud. So a lot of what we've learned with federated identity is now being applied to these sorts of scenarios. Cyber attacks is obviously an ongoing threat. I'm not going to stand here and claim that federated identity is going to solve the problem of cyber attacks, but it does help in one crucial way, and that is it reduces the number of places that our identity information needs to be held. So 10 years ago, we'd go to a website, we'd sign up, we'd give information. We don't know how securely that information is being held, how well, whether those sites are adhering to the best security principles. What federated identity does is it allows us to hold information about ourselves and our users in fewer places, and then exchange only the necessary information to enable you to sign into a particular site. I mean, that's if it's implemented in a kind of responsible manner. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about standards, but really from a technical space, there's kind of two main standards in play. There's the SAML that, for those of us who've worked in this space for quite a lot of time, are pretty familiar with now. SAML's been around for a long time. It's very widely used now in the enterprise space. So organizations looking to, say, procure a new software system as a service will generally look for or require support for one or the other of these standards. OpenID Connect is slightly newer, and it really builds on a lot of what's been learned about this space over the last few years. It appeals a lot more to modern developers and some of the more modern use cases, like I mentioned, internet-connected devices, mobile access. So these are really the two main standards in play at the moment. The key thing, the last bullet point under SAML really is one of the key aspects that underpins OpenAthens, is that we can build this trust network, sometimes called trust fabric, that all of the members of OpenAthens, whether they're publishers or organizations, can sit on top of, that allows us to exchange information in really quite a trusted way. And I've got a couple of examples. But we're seeing a certain amount of convergence, and we're now working with both of these standards. So at our conference last year, we announced support for OpenID Connect in our publisher platform. So apologies for the formatting, gone a bit askew there. But really, what are the interactions that happen if I'm logging into a particular site? And I've got two different examples and for two quite different scenarios. So in a scenario where typically I would go to a site and sign up and create an account, I'm effectively self-certifying myself to access that. So I'm volunteering information. And really, this is just me saying to the site, I want to be known as this person. Here's how you contact me. the site doesn't really care about the authenticity of that information, so there's not really any trust associated with that. Whereas in the scenarios that we tend to deal with, there's the trust behind that exchange is far more important than the actual details of it. So specifically, who has issued this claim? So in this case, I am a member, or I have a particular role at my organisation, and again, I could be contacted at a particular address. In the case of OpenAthens, this tends to be not my email address, but some anonymised ID. So it's not even personally identifiable to myself. So those are the two. This is what we mean by trusted identity versus untrusted. But in both cases, this information is being exchanged between the two parties. So really what I'm going to try and convince you of the next few slides is that we're in a space now where we need specialists around identity to make all of this hang together. Identity is an increasingly complex space, and in order to get the best of it, we need to have specialists in particular areas. So I've grouped these into three particular types. So in the enterprise space, there's players, so many of us use Azure and Office 365. We've probably all got Google and Facebook accounts. OpenAthens and Shibboleth really fit into a third type of specialist service that is really built around community, this trusted community of, in our case, publishers and organizations that you effectively plumb into and can exchange information in a trusted manner. So what I'm not about to say is that somehow we've got way better authentication methods and usernames and passwords are going away or becoming irrelevant. We all know that usernames and passwords are flawed in many ways. Should we have a strong password policy? Should we have a policy that encourages users to place post-it notes? We know all of the problems around usernames and passwords, but they are understood by users. It's a simple system, but they're not a one-size-fits-all. We cannot apply usernames and passwords to all possible scenarios online to protect our information. So many of us are now familiar with two-step authentication. So just quick survey, who in their sort of everyday would use a two-step authentication process? Just put your hands up. And if you leave your hands up, if that is on any of your personal accounts rather than the work account. So quite a few, probably not a representative audience. So I think that the number of sort of personal accounts that people use two-step auth is extremely low. So this is really sort of bringing us into the space of multi-factor authentication. And when people hear that, people traditionally think, oh, that's really bad for the user experience. It's more complicated. It's adding extra steps, which in this example it is. But what's really becoming far more important now is using different factors of authentication in different contexts. So we're getting this term coined now called contextual authentication. So what really this means is if we have a specialist identity system that can take a lot of factors into account and raise and lower the strength of authentication depending on, firstly, what the user's trying to do, maybe where they are, that isn't actually about making the user experience worse by adding additional steps. In some cases, that might be the case. In other cases, the user might not actually be visibly challenged for credentials. So it's a far more sort of sophisticated approach to authentication to ultimately make the systems more secure and improve the user experience. So what we want as users is for the friction around authentication to be reduced. But we as users also have our own expectations. We expect our banks to have secure means. In those contexts, we we don't mind to have to go through additional steps. So it's basically, in those circumstances, if the authentication is appropriate to the user's expectations, as well as just some security policy, then the user is happier and sort of more willing to engage in that authentication process. So just as a few examples by what I mean by some of these factors. So it might be that my device itself is trusted. So that might mean the first time I signed in with an account on that device, I had to go through some additional steps. From that point forward, then that device is trusted. Maybe a token's dropped onto that device that says, yes, this is, next time the user signs in, we can use a lower strength of authentication. Location and networks can still play an important part in authentication. If I'm within my company network, I maybe don't need to go through that second step of authentication. Usernames and passwords, as I said, are definitely here to stay. And then we have a whole range of second factors, whether it's SMS, notifications via an apps, down to hardware tokens. But also, we can also look at sort of far more kind of passive factors in authentication, like, is me signing on from New York on a Friday night part of my normal behavior pattern? If it's not, then again, I'm going to up the strength of authentication to verify that. So because federated identity allows us to turn to specialist systems, we can implement far more appropriate and strong authentication methods, but also those that actually give a better user experience as well. So I've got to admit, I can't remember where I heard this quote, but I really liked it at the time, in that in a connected world now, the identity is becoming the firewall of the cloud. So all of the examples I've used around software as a service is that identity is the key point that allows these interactions to take place. So there's been a trend within the security space for some time now to really accept that kind of fortifying our networks is not the sole means that we can actually protect our data. We can fortify our networks as much as we like, but you still have people putting devices on and off them. And in many ways, people are the weakest link in the system. And you can have the strongest network as possible, but you're not going to eliminate those factors. So this has really been a realization within the security space for some time. And of course, having secure networks means that you have to implement tools like VPNs that effectively put people onto that network, which in turn give a bad user experience because they're slow, they can drop out, they don't work on my phone necessarily. So perimeter security is really a trend. Yeah, we're not going to throw away our firewalls, but they're not our sole sort of defense anymore. So just as an example, Google have implemented a drive the last few years to set down some principles for some of their own corporate systems. So firstly, they say that connecting from a particular network must not determine access to the individual services. So ultimately what that means is each service is secured regardless of how you're getting to it. So if you're on an internal network, your access is no different from if you're on an external network. So the network itself is not some secure entity in its own right, because if it is, then people are inclined to put open systems on it that can then lead to data leaks. And then access to the service instead is granted by effectively our identity systems. So what do we know about you and what do we know about your device? So using some of the authentication methods that I've described. And of course, we're in a space where things are becoming more increasingly encrypted by default. So networks are, or the internet is sort of more rapidly than ever becoming encrypted by default. And then Google and others have been quite at the forefront of pushing the use of SSL sort of by default. You get ranked higher if you do so. And other drives like Let's Encrypt, which allows us to effectively get SSL certificates for free. So the internet is increasingly becoming encrypted by default. So we've got a few minutes left, so I'll open up for questions. Yeah.
Jonathan Eaton, London Business School. Thank you, David, for an excellent and very clear summary of these trends. Just reflecting back on my own organisational experience and thinking about what you were outlining, we're already seeing pressure from corporate learning partners that they want to consume our services, access our services, but on their authentication and authorization terms, e.g. a corporate with Azure AD wanting to effectively federate with us. And we're in the early stages of making that happen. This seems to me to be very much the kind of wikinomics idea, this challenge of organizations having to be porous as well as secure. And I just wondered if you had comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just reflects the way modern organizations work. I mean, it's like organizations are porous, people move between them, particularly in our space. So one of the examples we have in OpenAthens is we have a lot of overlap between, say, our users in the NHS and our users in HEFE. So those are good examples, is like how can you get access to data through either one of those identities? And that, yeah, it might, in your case, mean joining up another authentication system into a central system. So these are the sorts of use cases really that I think OpenAthens exists to try and solve. We're kind of the glue that holds together a lot of systems. As I said in one of my earlier slides around both SAML and OpenID Connect, the user doesn't care or even need to know what's being used under the hood. It's the role of the technology in these systems to join up.
Just as a footnote, I think the real challenge is setting the boundaries, the hard boundaries that must exist in terms of permissive relationship that only goes so far in terms of content, because it's a function of the customer or the user's role and their rights versus another user in the organisation with more flexible and fuller rights. Thank you very much.
There's a very interesting sort of trade-off that you identified when you were talking about contextual authentication and the idea of a system being able to give you access because it knows that you don't normally try to sign in from New York. Obviously, there's an interesting trade-off there, which is that the system has to know where you normally spend your time. So in exchange for the ease of access, you have to really trust, again, the sign-in system to be tracking you all the time so that it knows that you normally sign in from London. Yeah. I just thought, it's just wondering what you thought about that trade-off.
Yeah, absolutely. And in that case, say your organisation using ADFS, then obviously the administrator of your organisation can identify trusted networks where you might have a lower sense of authentication. But I mean, equally, it's something you can throw machine learning at as well in terms of does this look like abnormal usage patterns? If that's the case, don't block the user, but use a stronger authentication to verify that it really is the user. Yeah, it's a matter of building more sophisticated systems, which, as I said, the theme is improving the user experience, and it can improve the user experience.
Hello, Jim Evans from the Office for National Statistics. It seems to me what you've shown so far is quite one way in that you're being asked for credentials and you're supplying those credentials into those systems, and then any other system could potentially use that as a federated source. Is there anything happening in the authentication space that lets me as a user know that who I'm supplying those credentials to are themselves a bona fide organization?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's not really an area I touched on. So I think you're talking about consent, that users sort of granting consent to their release.
Yeah.
So that is one of the benefits of federated identity is that it can be deployed in a way that a user can grant consent, and this is quite baked in as a concept for things like OpenID Connect. I think we're hearing about that in the next session. But yes, in the OpenAthens space, because we don't exchange personal identifying information by default, that isn't something that's widely used because it's another step that the user goes through. But one of the real powers of federated identity is that the user can grant consent, but also in a way that we can exchange the smallest amount of information necessary for the user to be granted access. So if, say, a site has an age limit, so it's over 18s only, you don't have to exchange the user's date of birth to enable that. You just need to exchange whether the user meets that criteria or not. So it's kind of disclosing the minimum information possible to grant access. So again, that's where policy around federations like OpenAthens and some of the similar federations can set the kind of vocabulary. So if the community needs a attribute that defines whether the user meets particular age criteria, say, then a federation can set that and avoid unnecessary information being released if it's not necessary.